Last time we spoke about the beginning of winter. In October of 1941, two vast armies stood toe-to-toe on a winter-thin road towards Moscow. On one side, the Wehrmacht, hungry for a swift triumph, reshaped its backbone. Panzer groups, now panzer armies, roared across Ukrainian and Russian plains, with tanks as headlines. On the other side, the Red Army, led by General Zhukov, who refused to yield, raided defense lines from Leningrad to Moscow, and rebuilt the Mozhaisk line with stubborn grit. The air smelled of fuel and fear as Operation Typhoon began. The Germans punched across the Desna and Dnieper, their armor moving like clockwork, yet every bridge they crossed whispered a new limit of fuel shortages, stretched supply lines, and stubborn Soviet countermeasures. In the north, Hitler's orders clashed with battlefield reality. In the south, stalwart cities like Orel and Vyazma flickered with hard-fought breakthroughs and costly retreats. As October wore on, the myth of an easy victory dissolved. Hitler boasted that the end was near, while soldiers on both sides kept their heads above the smoke, counting casualties and praying for more favorable weather. The siege of Moscow loomed, a hinge that could tilt the war's fate. This episode is Mud and Sieges. Well, hello again, and welcome back to the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more. Go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War, my podcast series found on all major podcast platforms. Over on Echoes of War, we just finished up the Greco-Persian War series. And on the Pacific War channel, I just released a review of a new Pacific War anime called Cocoon. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights with subjects I will tackle next. The latest episode over my exclusive podcast series is actually a look at the logistical war behind the Guadalcanal campaign of World War II. So if that's of interest to you, please go check it out. Rain begins to fall across the Eastern Front as the dreaded Rasputitsa settles in. Autumn arrives just as Operation Typhoon climbs to its zenith. German generals speak of an inexorable victory. Their voices carry over mud-slicked roads and rain-soaked fields. Supply columns bog down in quagmires, while infantry fight with dwindling ammunition, damaged equipment, and the iron will to grind the enemy into submission. In Moscow, Stalin, unsettled and wary, recalls General Zhukov to the capital to organize the defense as one fortress after another buckles under the German onslaught. Now, what do I mean when I say Rasputitsa? It's a term used to describe the annual mud season in parts of Eastern Europe, particularly Russia and Ukraine, where unpaved roads and the countryside becomes nearly impassable due to heavy rains in the spring or the thaw of the frozen ground in autumn. The word itself comes from the Russian roots meaning to trample, or laying the waste. But in practice, it captures the practical impossibility of moving troops, vehicles, and supplies through the soft, waterlogged terrain. I mean, I live in Quebec, Canada, and we have a pretty similar climate. And yeah, just before autumn and fall, we have a kind of similar situation. It's pretty rough. Now in spring, frost rules the ground. The soil switches from solid to a glue-like substance as the thaw sets in. Drainage is overwhelmed, and the mud swallows wheels and tracks. In autumn, rains saturate the already soft earth after harvest, turning fields and ridges into this kind of churned, sticky mire. Rasputitsa has a significant strategic implication in warfare by delaying or diverting movements, stranding logistics, and forcing commanders to rely on alternative routes, slower tempos, or temporary retreats. Its impact is not only militarily, it disrupts transportation, agriculture, and daily life, complicating aid delivery and civilian movement for extended periods. Rasputitsa repeatedly hinders warfare by turning military vehicles and artillery into mud-bound impediments. Coupled with winter conditions, this phenomenon is credited with slowing the campaigns of the Napoleonic Wars in 1812, our story of Nazi Germany during Operation Barbarossa, and all the belligerents in the recent 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's as relevant today as it was all the way back then. Now, last week, Army Group Center advanced rapidly into the Soviet defenses surrounding Moscow, with the panzers achieving progress reminiscent of the war's earlier days. The Red Army did not fare well during the first week of October 1941. We are now entering the second week as General Zhukov assumes command of the defenses of the Soviet capital. From October the 8th to the 14th, the Soviet Union will strive to hold back the invaders as the situation continues to deteriorate. Operations in the farthest reaches of the Arctic Soviet Union have bogged down by mid-October. Operation Silver Fox aimed to seize Murmansk and its port facilities, placing them out of the communist hands. Operation Silver Fox was planned as a two-stage pincer maneuver executed in three operations. Operation 1, Operation Reindeer, or Unternehmen Reindeer, involved the 2nd and 3rd Mountain Divisions of the Mountain Corps, Norway under Edward Dietl. They were to advance east from Kokene into the Finnish-held Patsamo area to secure the nickel mines there. Phase 2 envisioned a pincer against the Soviet port of Murmansk, which remained ice-free in winter, and of course there was Arkhangelsk, likely serving as a route for the Western Allied supplies to the Soviet Union. The first prong, Operation Platinum Fox, Unternehmen Plattenthek, was a frontal assault from Patsamo towards Murmansk with the aim of securing the Lybachi Peninsula with Finnish border support. The second prong, Operation Arctic Fox, or Unternehmen Polarfox, would strike further south to seize Sala, ceded to the Soviet Union after the Winter War, and then push east along the railway to capture Kandalaksha, thereby severing the Murmansk railway linking Murmansk with the central part of Russia. This operation involved the German 36th Corps under Hans Fige and the Finnish 3rd Corps led by Hjalmar Sielasvuo. Aerial support for the offensive was to come from Luftwaffe 5, based in Norway, and the Finnish Air Force. For Silver Fox, the Luftwaffe established a new headquarters in Finland. At the outset of the hostilities, the Finnish Air Force fielded about 230 aircraft. Luftwaffe 5 assigned about 60 aircraft to Silver Fox in Finland, employing the Junkers Ju-87, the 88, the Heinkel HE-111 for close air support. By late February of 1941, German units had moved into Finland, and transit rights through neutral Sweden enabled the movement of the 2nd and 3rd Mountain Divisions into Kokenes for Operation Reindeer. For the 36th Corps, two sea transport operations, Blue Fox 1 and Blue Fox 2, were arranged. Units embarked at Stettin or Oslo for Oulu, then they traveled by train to Rovaniemi, where they linked up with the Finnish forces for the offensive under border defense pretenses. Soviet preparations were tentative. Stalin did not expect a German invasion along the entire border so soon. The primary Soviet opponent was the Northern Front, comprising the 7th and 14th Armies in the Arctic, commanded by Lieutenant General Markian Popov. On August 23rd, the Northern Front was split into the Karelian Front and the Leningrad Front. Frolov, who had commanded the 14th Army, was succeeded by Roman Panin when he assumed command of the Karelian Front on September 1st. And in the early weeks, Axis forces had numerical superiority, the Soviets having roughly 150,000 troops north of Lake Ladoga. Axis air supremacy followed as Soviet Karelia was defended by the 1st and 55th Mixed Air Divisions, totaling some 273 serviceable aircraft, but they were obsolete types. Operation Silver Fox began on the 22nd of June of 1941 to coincide with Operation Barbarossa. Mountain Corps Norway, comprising the 2nd and 3rd Mountain Divisions under Edward Dietl, moved east from Kirkenes into the Finnish-held Patsamo area to secure the nickel mines. The appearance of a German corps on the Soviet border surprised the Russians, and the operation succeeded in establishing a foothold around Patsamo as Dietl began reorganizing for Platinum Fox. Farther south, Vege's 36th Corps prepared for its attack on Sala. On June the 29th, Dietl launched an eastward assault with Finnish border units against two Soviet divisions of the 14th Army, the 14th and 52nd Rifle Divisions. The opening day saw the 2nd Mountain Division secure the neck of the Lybachi Peninsula, while the 3rd Mountain Division breached Soviet lines at the Titovka Valley, capturing a bridge over the river. As the element of surprise faded, German momentum slowed under growing Soviet resistance and the harsh Arctic conditions. The rough terrain, lack of detailed maps, and freezing weather impeded progress, and by July the 2nd Mountain Division had halted at the Rasputitsa Peninsula, taking defensive positions at its neck, with several units diverted south to aid the 3rd Mountain Division. With reinforcements scarce, the Germans advanced east to establish a bridgehead over the Leitza River, but a Soviet flank landing threatened these positions. Detailed pressed for reinforcements, yet the German High Command limited relief, providing only marginal aid from Norway. Supply problems compounded the stalemate as the Soviet and British naval activity along the Norwegian coast disrupted German shipping, weakening Mountain Corps Norway further. Renewed offensives failed. The Soviets closed the Leitza bridgehead on the 21st of September, and the operation halted. Mountain Corps Norway was ordered to defend the front and secure the Patsamo area and its nickel mines, ruling out a renewed offensive. The northern front then remained relatively stable for the remainder of the war, aside from some small-scale ski patrol skirmishes. Parallel to Platinum Fox, Arctic Fox began on July the 1st. The German main forces at Sala consisted of the 169th Division, the SS Infantry Kampfgruppe Nord, and the Finnish 6th Division, facing 3 Soviet divisions from the 14th Army, those being the 122nd Rifle Division, the 104th Rifle Division, and the 1st Tank Division. The Germans launched a frontal assault on Sala, while the Finnish 6th Division attempted a substantial flanking attack behind the Soviet lines towards Älekoti and Kerali. The initial assault faltered due to inadequate Arctic warfare training, and the SS Division, composed largely of former police units, struggled against organized Soviet defenses. After repeated failures, the 36th Corps redirected its efforts and, with the Finnish flanking maneuver by the 6th Division, breached the Soviet defenses on July the 6th. Sala fell on the 8th, and the Soviets began to retreat towards Kairali. The Germans then pursued to Kairali on the 9th, but heavy resistance and challenging terrain, lakes and fortified positions, prevented further progress, creating a stalemate for the rest of the month. To the south, the Finnish 3rd Corps advanced east from Kuusamo to support the Sala effort, aiming to reach Kestanga and Utka in a 2-pronged attack, and then move towards Loki and Kem to sever the Murmansk Railway. The 3rd Corps made rapid progress, crossing the canal between Lake Bayazero and Lake Topozero within 20 days, and then they reached Kestanga by August 7th. But Soviet reinforcements, including the 88th Rifle Division, halted the Finnish advance. The German command, impressed by the Finnish pace, moved additional 36th Corps units south to bolster the effort. Despite earlier gains, Soviet resistance intensified, stalling the Finns' momentum. In mid-August, the 36th Corps renewed its push on Kairali from the north, and with the Finnish 6th Division from the south, encircling the Soviet forces. After clearing the perimeter, the 36th Corps advanced east again, capturing Älekoti and pushing towards the Votya and Verman rivers near pre-war border fortifications. Exhausted by heavy resistance, Vege's forces could not sustain the drive, and the German High Command redirected available units to the south, placing the 36th Corps on the defensive by late September. Bolstered by new German reinforcements, the Finnish 3rd Corps launched a final push on October the 30th. Despite stronger Soviet defenses and additional reinforcements, Finnish troops managed to encircle an entire Soviet regiment. However, on the 17th of November, the Finnish command abruptly halted the offensive after diplomatic pressure from the United States, which warned that disrupting U.S. deliveries to the Soviet Union would have a serious consequence for Finland. Consequently, Arctic Fox would end in November, and both sides entrenched themselves at their current positions. By October, the Arctic ports were already proving to be a lifeline for the Soviet Union. Murmansk and Arkhangelsk offered the fastest routes for British-American supplies to reach the front. Convoys departing from Iceland or Britain could reach the port in just about 2 weeks. By comparison, the Basra route in the Persian Gulf required close to 3 months, making the Arctic supply path dramatically swifter. Besides the Basra route, there was also, of course, the Vladivostok route for shipping. This path took about 20 days by sea, but the goods were roughly 5,000 miles farther from the Soviet industrial heartland. Moreover, these 2 ports were much closer to the front lines and existing Soviet infrastructure, enabling materials and resources to be deployed much quicker. Of the 2 Arctic ports, Murmansk was the more valuable one to the war effort. Despite its latitude, it remained ice-free year-round, while Arkhangelsk did not and was effectively useless during the long and dark winter months. The Germans recognized the strategic value of the port, and decided in the early stages of planning for Barbarossa that its capture was essential. Thus far, this objective had remained out of reach for the combined German and Finnish attackers. The Army of Norway, commanded by General Falkenhorst, was under-resourced for the task, and struggled with coordinating with its nominal Finnish allies. The Finns were dutiful soldiers, but they limited their attacks to align with their nation's war strategy. The Finns remained cautious about unlimited support for Hitler's war. They continued to attack the Red Army, but only to the extent that it served their own objectives. Despite German propaganda portraying the invasion of the Soviet Union as a clash of civilizations, few of Hitler's allies were willing to actually give their all-in for the struggle. Finland was fighting for territory that it had lost during the Winter War with the Soviet Union in 1939 to 1940. For this reason, the Finns preferred to refer to their war as the Continuation War, viewing their participation as separate from Germany's wider European war aims. To the Finns, it was a joint war against a common enemy. Accordingly, Finland declined to be seen as a German ally and never officially joined the Axis, but stylized their relationship to that as a co-belligerent. With a country of only 3.9 million people, Finland fielded an army of about 476,000, and by late summer, there was roughly 650,000 people working directly for the armed services, constructing fortifications, roads, and bridges, serving as nurses, air raid wardens, and supply services. The manpower drain imposed a massive burden on the Finnish economy, with industry losing about 50% of its workers and agriculture about 70%. By October, Finland was forced to appeal to Germany for 175,000 tons of grain just to survive until the 1942 harvest. Meanwhile, the threat of a declaration of war from Britain and the United States grew, as Finland refused to halt its advance even after reoccupying its 1939 frontier established by the Peace of Tartu in 1920. Up to that point, the Western powers had tolerated Finland's co-belligerency despite strenuous Soviet objections, but they were not prepared to endanger relations further for a Greater Finland. Militarily, the war was proving extraordinarily costly for the Finns, with approximately 75,000 casualties in 1941 alone, and coupled with the worsening economic crisis, it seemed unsustainable for them to be in the war beyond 1941. The much-anticipated quick victory over the Soviet Union had failed to materialize, necessitating major structural changes and a comprehensive demobilization of the army. Between the end of 1941 and the spring of 1942, the Finnish army shrank to about 150,000 men occupying defensive positions along a relatively quiet front. This allowed Allied Lend-Lease supplies to flow unhindered from the northern ports, easing the pressure on Leningrad, and it freed up Soviet troops for deployment on other more critical fronts. Thus, in 1941, Germany's single biggest contributor of foreign troops to the war against the Soviet Union had evolved from an aggressive co-belligerent to a more passive advocate. Wavering support for Mannerheim's government caused serious alarm in the German High Command. This helped explain why Army Group North was being pushed so hard to cover the eastern shores of Lake Ladoga. Meeting the Finns was crucial for two reasons. First, the Finns had made clear they were not interested in further advances themselves. Second, officers in the OKH believed that a link-up would restore Finnish confidence in the alliance. Hitler agreed with these conclusions, and it was the driving force behind the planning of Army Group North's next offensive. Army Group North had reached a stalemate with the Leningrad and northwestern fronts. General Liebe was doing his best to stabilize his front lines and prepare for a renewed offensive. We detailed those plans last week. This localized offensive aimed to push the Soviets back from the shores of Lake Ladoga. Meanwhile, the Germans continued their bombardment of Leningrad. The city's large urban sprawl and persistent Soviet counter-battery fire complicated the efforts. Counter-battery actions are artillery-on-artillery duels for those who don't know. A battery of guns seeks to return fire on the attacker by tracking and plotting the positions of the enemy artillery, and so forth. Despite the German attempts to saturate the city with artillery and air bombardment, Army Group North lacked the resources to achieve this fully. The Lake Ladoga supply route, however, kept the Leningrad front well stocked with ammunition. Ration stocks were declining, but the defenders still had a lot of fight left in them. Zhukov appointed a trusted officer to command the defenses. General Fedyunsky was supported by the Stavka representative. On the 12th and the 14th, the Leningrad front was ordered to break the German hold on Shizaburg. Fedyuninsky began preparations immediately, but they would not be ready until the middle of the following week. The first week of Operation Typhoon had gone brilliantly for the invaders. They managed to encircle 8 Soviet field armies at Bryansk and Vyazma, and Hitler and his entourage were quite ecstatic. There was very little to complain about the second week. However, warning signs were starting to trickle in. It had snowed across much of the front on the 7th. Logistics remained hampered by the poor state of the Soviet infrastructure, and many of the rebuilt panzers were already starting to break down. The German encirclement battles in the eastern campaigns had historically proven less than airtight. At Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev, tens of thousands of men managed to escape the loosely guarded pockets. Bryansk and Vyazma were no different. It had been estimated that around 80,000 men escaped from the Vyazma pocket alone. The Germans could ill afford to let numbers like these escape, but there were simply not enough resources to seal such pockets. To be sure, the losses were devastating to the defending Soviets. Contrary to German propaganda, the Soviet Union did not have unlimited manpower. The Red Army could muster just about 1.2 million men to defend Moscow. The entirety of the Red Army stood at roughly 3.2 million, but the manpower reserves were now very shallow. Many of the recently inducted men had only the barest whiff of any training. Compared to their German counterparts, they were little more than a rank of amateurs in the realm of tactical competence. The surviving veterans of the earlier titanic clashes with the Germans were scattered throughout the army. This prevented the Red Army from forming any set of particularly experienced or talented units. However, it allowed for the experience of one man to trickle outward to many men in his unit. Therefore, the impact of the veteran officers, the NCOs, and the junior soldiers in the Red Army was amplified. The loss of the 8 field armies in the double envelopment at Bryansk and Vyazma appeared as an incredibly dangerous possibility as the second week of October began. As the fighting around these pockets continued, the German High Command decided to press along a broad front. Rather than throwing their entire effort at the main objective, they ordered Hoth's 3rd Panzer Army to Kalinin and then to operate north of Moscow. In the south, Guderian would continue to advance with his Panzer Army, split his 48th Panzer Corps, who would attempt to capture Kursk, which lay south of his main effort directed at Tula, while Schweppenberg's 24th Panzer Corps was at Tula and would direct its push towards Moscow. The 47th Panzer Corps was assigned to reduce the Bryansk pocket. Hopna's 4th Panzer Army was kept on a short leash by Kluge, who wanted his men in armor to stay close to the Vyazma pocket. These pockets were far from airtight, and the Soviets continued to fight hard to break out. Indeed, in small battles scattered around the periphery, groups of Red Army soldiers managed local victories. The Germans were spread too thinly to cover all of the escape venues. The vastness of the dual envelopments betrayed their purpose, as they had at Minsk and Smolensk earlier in the war. The German field commanders apparently refused to recognize this, and they continued to believe that all could be made good with just one more advance. On the 8th, tensions around Guderian's right flank began to rise. The trapped Soviets were attempting to break out, and there was not enough pressure from the diminished Wehrmacht to continue them. By the 9th, the situation evolved into a full-blown crisis, centered on the small town of Sizemka. There was a gap of unknown size between 2 infantry divisions, the 29th Motorized holding the eastern flank of the Bryansk pocket, and to their left, the 293rd Infantry Division guarding the southern flank. However, a significant gap in their lines remained. The Soviet 13th Army, trapped inside the pocket, saw this weakness and threw what they could at it. This breakout attempt caused panic in Guderian's headquarters. He ordered the 25th Motorized Infantry to fill the gap. They could only get into place after several hours of delay, and the situation continued to develop in the meantime. Guderian halted the advance of Kemp's 48th Panzer Corps towards Kursk, and he diverted them northward. The Soviets continued to pressure the German lines, but once the 25th Motorized arrived late in the day, the situation stabilized. This was an obfuscation at best. Thousands of soldiers had indeed slipped from the grasp of the invaders. Post-war Soviet accounts alleged that whole divisions had actually made it out intact. The situation remained fluid enough that even Bach refused to characterize the event as a true envelopment, or a pocket by the usual standard. Guderian's position remained in flux for much of the week. His rapid advance, having again left behind infantry, needed to secure the pocket before continuing with planned movements. The confused command situation for the Red Army continued into the second week of October. Indeed, some blamed the Bryansk-Vyazma failure on this arrangement. The Western, Bryansk, and Reserve fronts had no single point of command and coordination. They reported directly to the Stavka, which was attempting to coordinate the entire war effort. The German speed of attack remained unmatched by the cumbersome Red Army. Even now, as the second week began, some units had been effectively cut off for days and they did not even realize it, a situation especially true around Vyazma. The command situation only began to improve on October the 10th. Zhukov was placed in charge of a unified command that incorporated all the remnants of the three fronts together. This was a major step in improving the defense of Moscow, and it demonstrated Stalin's renewed trust in Zhukov after his dismissal from the Stavka earlier in the year. The situation around Vyazma looked grim for the defenders. Kluge was working hard to ensure that the encirclement remained tight, aiming to prevent the wholesale escape that had occurred at Smolensk and Minsk. Yet he faced opposition from the other commanders. Hauptmann and Bach both wanted to resume the drive east as soon as possible, understanding that any delay would allow the Red Army to regroup on a new defensive line, as they had after every encirclement. Kluge resisted, arguing that reducing the holding forces around the pocket would let significant forces escape, thus enabling the very rebuilding that haunted Bach and the panzer commanders. Both sides prevented valid tactical points, and compromise became the guiding principle. Kluge was through and through a classic German infantry officer. He had been arguing with the panzer commanders since the Polish campaign and before. Notably, Guderian had been his primary nemesis in Trans, and in the earlier months of 1940, but Kluge clashed with nearly all the panzer commanders in that due time. He believed in the thorough methods of his forefathers, and disdained the reckless advance advocated by Hauptmann Guderian and the others. Bach allowed Kluge to keep the panzers, but he ordered that he compress the pocket into extinction at the earliest possible moment. Hitler then stepped in, and on the 9th he ordered Hauptmann to extend northward to relieve the 3rd Panzer Army from the encirclement. Hoth was then sent south to take over the 17th Army after its commander was relieved. General Stubnagel faced accusations of timid leadership stemming from a dispute with Army Group South's commander. Hoth was ultimately relieved by Reichenau, who had previously been one of his corps commanders. The 3rd Panzer Army was needed to start the drive on Kalinin and threaten the Soviet Northwestern Front. This stretched Hauptmann's 4th Panzer Army to the breaking point, as he was still ordered to continue advancing on Moscow. It was at this moment that the Soviets managed to begin attacking the Vyazma encirclement from the outside. The forces within the pocket had not given up either, tenaciously defending against infantry assaults from the west. On the 10th, Major General Helmich's 23rd Infantry were nearly overrun. The Soviets overwhelmed the infantry's improvised positions and broke through in several places. Only with the help of a sister division's reserves could Helmich restore his lines. The Germans were beginning to crack, even on the northern side of the pocket that should have been secure. The 7th Panzer Division's positions could not be reached by any of Hauptmann's relief forces. They were forced to bunker down and endure the assaults. Men dug fighting positions up to their necks. Even as the Germans were battered to the breaking point, they managed to hold on. The Soviets were steadily squeezed. By October the 11th, the Vyazma pocket had shrunk from about 2,000 square kilometers to just 400. Major Shabulin, an officer from the 50th Army, wrote in his diary on October the 15th, "I am reeling, corpses, the horrors of war, uninterrupted shelling. Again, I am hungry, and I have not slept in a long time. I have confiscated a bottle of liquor. I went to a forest and I did a reconnaissance. The disaster is complete. The army is defeated. The baggage train is destroyed. The army has been turned into shambles." Major Shabulin stumbled through the forest for a few more days before eventually locating Major General Petrov, the commander of his army. However, both men were killed before they could even find friendly lines. As the twin pockets were steadily reduced, Red Army soldiers who managed to escape the carnage took one of 3 paths. Most avoided contact and fled eastward in an attempt to reach Soviet lines again. A few surrendered to the nearest German units, but this was far fewer than earlier in the year. The 3rd path was to take up arms and go to the rear and attack anything they could. This had become the choice taken by Red Army soldiers trapped behind enemy lines since June. They attacked supply columns, blew up bridges, made contact with partisans, and otherwise proved to be a considerable thorn in the side of the German operations. Army Group South was advancing relatively quickly across Ukraine. The first week of October had seen some hiccups, but Mariupol fell on the 9th to the SS Division Adolf Hitler. Halder complained that the Italian divisions were barely sufficient even for static security positions. Mussolini had sent the Italian Expeditionary Corps despite less than enthusiasm from Hitler. They were poorly equipped and only semi-motorized. This caused mobility issues trying to keep up with Kleist's fast-moving panzers, to whom that they were attached. The 17th Army made good progress under their new commander. Hoth was not thrilled to be assigned to the infantry, but it was considered a promotion. The situation he found on arrival was not ideal, but his task was very straightforward. Push his infantry through Donetsk. The 17th Army had to break through the slogging match first, facing 3 Soviet field armies in its path: the 21st Army to the north, the 38th in the center, and the 6th in the south. Little progress was made in the first week of Hoth's command, though he managed to straighten his lines and eliminate a Soviet bulge on his southern flank. Further south, the 11th Army operated in concert with the Romanian 3rd Army to pin the Soviets in place while Kleist drove south. The Italians did their best to hold the northern flank of this movement. The capture of Mariupol signaled the end of the Red Army on the Sea of Azov. By the 11th, what had become known as the Battle of the Sea of Azov was over, a resounding German victory, but achieved at a very heavy cost. The Soviets had lost about 65,000 prisoners and well over 100 tanks. The Germans suffered around 12,000 casualties, with an unknown number of vehicles lost. The victory allowed the 11th Army to turn towards Crimea and unleash its full force. The advance had stalled since the turn of the month amidst the Romanians' crisis. It would now be resumed in full. Kleist's 1st Panzer Army would be responsible for taking Rostov. Yet as he began to resume the assault, the supply situation grew almost catastrophic. The June-to-date strain on the Wehrmacht supply system, coupled with the terrible weather, rendered it essentially non-functional. The southwestern front seized a momentary pause, throwing another wave of divisions into the Rostov defense. At Odessa, the Red Army finally pulled its last troops out and evacuated them to Sevastopol. It had taken about 2 months and 8 days, but the Germans and the Romanian allies had broken through to the coast. It was not the last siege of the Eastern Front. Lessons learned on both sides would be applied to Leningrad, Stalingrad, and Sevastopol, amongst others. The inability of the Germans or any of their allies to prevent the naval evacuation of Odessa was a testament to their fundamental weakness at sea. Even at this stage of the war, they could do little beyond harassing enemy formations outside of their core areas. Even in the Mediterranean, the Axis fleets demonstrated an inability to control the sea. This would come back to haunt them as the North African campaigns progressed into 1942. And if you're looking to learn more about that, please go over to Echoes of War, where I have a 10-part series covering the entire North African campaign. The operations there would prove to be quite a drain on valuable attention and materials from the Eastern Front in the months ahead. There was no significant Axis naval operations in the Black Sea for the remainder of the war. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. If after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. And if you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. In the cold, mud-slicked dawn of October of 1941, 2 colossal armies faced off along the Moscow Road. The Germans, hungry for a quick win, pushed with the power of their panzers, while the Soviets, guided by General Zhukov, hastily rallied their defenses. Rasputitsa wove its muddy traps, delaying tanks and sealing bridges, as autumn rain turned roads into glue and hunger into courage. Amidst encirclements and bitter retreats, the Red Army honed in on its resolve. Yet by the winter's edge, more sieges were beginning to loom.